If you compared your IQ score to your grandfather's, he would likely be classified as intellectually disabled. That isn't an insult, it's a statistical fact. For the last 100 years, humans have been getting smarter at a rate of 3 IQ points per decade. That is a massive 30-point jump. Think of it this way. If you took an average person from today and dropped them into 1920, they would score in the 98th percentile. Basically, if you walked into a room of 100 people back then, you'd be smarter than 98 of them. We should be living in a world of super geniuses. We should have cured cancer and solved cold fusion by now. But we haven't. And that leads to a scary question. Did we actually get smarter? Or did we just break the test? This phenomenon is called the Flynn effect. It's the biggest mystery in intelligence research. And just as scientists were trying to solve it, something even crazier happened. The trend stopped. We aren't getting smarter anymore. We're starting to get dumber. The discovery. In the 1980s, Flynn was comparing IQ scores across different countries when he noticed something bizarre. Test makers would periodically re-standardize their tests, basically updating them so the average score stayed at 100. But when Flynn looked at what was happening during these re-standardizations, he found people weren't just maintaining their scores. They were crushing the old tests. In his 2007 book, What is Intelligence? Beyond the Flynn effect, Flynn described what he found. People who scored 100 on a new test would have scored about 106 on the test from 20 years earlier. And this wasn't happening in just one country, it was everywhere researchers looked. The United States, Britain, Japan, the Netherlands. Nearly every industrialized nation showed the same mysterious climb. The most dramatic example, the Netherlands between 1972 and 1982. In just 10 years, scores jumped more than 8 points. Flynn calculated that by 1982 standards, 9.1% of Dutch test takers would have scored above 140, the genius threshold used by Lewis Terman in his famous 1920s study of gifted children. That's 24 times more geniuses than just a decade earlier. As Flynn wrote, this should mean the Netherlands was experiencing a cultural renaissance too great to be overlooked, but it wasn't. There wasn't a sudden explosion of Dutch Einsteins and Marie Curies, which meant something very strange was going on. The puzzle deepens. Here's where it gets weirder. The gains weren't evenly distributed across different types of tests. The biggest increases appeared on something called Raven's progressive matrices, a test that shows you patterns of geometric shapes with one missing, and you have to figure out which shape completes the pattern. No words, no cultural knowledge required, just pure abstract reasoning. The kind of thing psychologists thought measured your raw, innate intelligence, these culture-fair tests that were supposed to be immune to learning and experience. Those showed the biggest gains of all. Meanwhile, tests of vocabulary and general knowledge, the stuff you'd expect people to get better at with more education, showed smaller improvements. As the 1996 American Psychological Association Task Force, led by Ulrich Neisser, reported in their landmark paper, Intelligence, Knowns and Unknowns, published in the journal American Psychologist, this pattern was striking and unexpected. If people were just getting more schooling, you'd expect the opposite pattern. The Flynn effect seemed to be saying, we're getting better at abstract thinking, not at accumulated knowledge. But why? Theory 1. Nutrition. Let's start with the most straightforward explanation. Maybe we're just growing healthier brains. Psychologist Richard Lynn pointed out that during the same century IQ scores rose, average height also increased dramatically, in some countries by 10 centimeters or more. Better nutrition, especially protein intake and micronutrients like iodine, leads to bigger, healthier bodies. Why not bigger, healthier brains? There's definitely something to this. We know from the research of Bruce Lanphier and colleagues published in Environmental Health Perspectives in 2005 that even low-level lead exposure reduces IQ scores in children. As developed countries removed lead from gasoline and paint starting in the 1970s, they literally removed a toxin that was making everyone slightly dumber. Lanphier's study found that environmental lead exposure in children who have maximal blood lead levels less than 10 micrograms per deciliter is inversely associated with intellectual function, meaning there's no safe level of lead exposure. But here's the problem. The Flynn effect started before most major nutritional improvements, and it continued rising in countries that had already achieved good nutrition decades ago. Japanese and American kids were already well fed by the 1960s, yet scores kept climbing through the 2000s. Nutrition might be part of the story, but it can't be the whole answer. Theory 2. Education. Okay, maybe it's education. We're spending more years in school than ever before. Stephen Ceci from Cornell demonstrated in his 1991 review in Developmental Psychology that schooling definitely affects IQ. He estimated each additional year of education boosts IQ scores by about 3.5 points. When schools closed in one Virginia county in the 1960s to avoid integration, children's scores dropped about 6 points for every missed year of school. School clearly matters. But here's the catch. The Flynn effect shows up strongest on tests of fluid intelligence. Your ability to solve novel problems you've never seen before. Not just crystallized intelligence, which is the stuff you learn in school. Think of it this way. Crystallized intelligence is like your hard drive storage. All the facts and words and information you've saved up. Fluid intelligence is like your processor speed, how fast you can figure out something brand new. The Flynn effect is strongest on the processor speed tests, not the hard drive tests. Raymond Cattell and John Horn distinguished between these two types back in the 1960s, and their framework helps us understand why education alone can't explain the pattern. More schooling should primarily boost your hard drive, not fundamentally upgrade your processor. Something else must be going on. Theory 3. Complexity of modern life. This is Flynn's own preferred explanation. And it's fascinating. Look around you right now. You're probably watching this on a smartphone, a device that didn't exist 20 years ago. You navigate complex menu systems, switch between multiple apps, process information from dozens of sources simultaneously. Your great-grandparents spent most of their time doing concrete physical tasks, farming, manufacturing, direct hands-on work. Modern life, Flynn argued in his 2007 book, has become abstractified. We constantly deal with categories, hypotheticals, and systems thinking. We classify things into taxonomies. We think about counterfactuals, what-if scenarios. We manipulate symbols and abstractions all day long. Flynn wrote that the 20th century saw a cultural shift toward more abstract scientific thinking at the expense of concrete, experiential thinking. Video games require you to learn complex rule systems. School emphasizes formal logic over practical experience. Even conversations have changed. We debate abstract concepts like justice and rights rather than just discussing immediate, tangible things. This constant exposure to abstract thinking might be training our brains to be better at exactly the kind of reasoning IQ tests measure. Not smarter in some deep fundamental way, just better at a particular cognitive style that modern life demands. But Flynn himself doubts this is the whole story. The limitation nobody talks about. Here's what's really strange. Flynn doesn't actually believe real intelligence has increased as much as the scores suggest. Think about it this way. If the gains were real, we should be seeing transformative changes in human achievement. Scientific breakthroughs should be accelerating. Artistic and literary output should be exploding. We should notice that people are dramatically better at solving real-world problems, but we don't see that. Yes, we have more scientists and more publications, but is each individual more intellectually capable? The evidence is murky at best. In the Intelligence Knowns and Unknowns report, NICE's team noted something troubling. While IQ scores were rising throughout the 1970s and 1980s, SAT scores, the test students take for college admission, were actually falling. How could people be getting smarter on IQ tests but worse on achievement tests? This suggests that IQ tests might be measuring something narrower than we thought. Maybe we're not getting smarter in general. Maybe we're just getting better at a specific kind of abstract problem solving that IQ tests happen to measure, while other cognitive skills stay the same or even decline. As Flynn provocatively put it, what has risen might not be intelligence itself, but merely abstract problem-solving ability, a much smaller slice of human cognitive capability. The plot twist. And now, the really weird part, the Flynn effect is stopping. In some countries, it's actually reversing. Edward Dutton and Richard Lynn published findings showing that in Norway, Denmark, and Finland, IQ scores peaked in the 1990s and have been declining since. Britain shows the same pattern. Even the United States shows signs of plateauing or reversing. Why? That's where the science gets really interesting, because testing why something happens is harder than just observing that it does. The French controversy. Now, before we go further, we need to talk about something that perfectly illustrates both how science works and how easy it is to be fooled by IQ data. In 2015, those same researchers, Dutton and Lynn, published a study claiming that IQ scores in France had declined by nearly 4 points in just a decade, from 1999 to 2009. It made headlines across French media with panic-inducing titles like "The IQ of the French in Freefall," and even a TV documentary called "Tomorrow We Will All Be Morons." Pretty alarming, right? The study seemed to provide clear evidence that the Flynn effect wasn't just stopping. It was reversing dramatically. But here's where it gets interesting. In 2021, researchers Corentin Gontier and Jacques Gregoire took a much closer look at the same data and discovered something crucial. The French weren't actually getting less intelligent. The tests themselves had changed. What Gontier and Gregoire found was fascinating. The apparent IQ decline was almost entirely on subtests measuring culturally loaded knowledge. Things like vocabulary, general information, and comprehension questions tied to specific cultural references. These items had simply become outdated. Imagine taking a test today that asks you about telephone booths, cassette tapes, or who the vice president was in 1999. You might struggle not because you're less intelligent, but because the cultural context has shifted. When they analysed the pattern carefully, they found that about a quarter of the items on these subtests had become significantly more difficult over time, not because people's brains had changed, but because the cultural knowledge being tested was no longer part of everyday experience. Meanwhile, performance on tests of actual reasoning ability, the kind of abstract problem-solving that doesn't depend on specific cultural knowledge, had remained stable or even improved slightly. And this teaches us something really important. When we're looking at IQ trends over time, we have to be incredibly careful about what we're actually measuring, testing the hypotheses. This is exactly why the study I'm about to tell you about is so brilliant. Because when researchers started reporting IQ declines, the critical questions were, are these declines real, and if they are, what's causing them? Some researchers initially thought maybe it's immigration, people moving from countries with lower average test scores, or dysgenic fertility, the idea that people with higher IQs are having fewer children, gradually shifting the population's genetic makeup. These hypotheses sound plausible. Changing demographics could shift the average, right? But here's where science gets really clever about testing ideas. In 2018, two Norwegian researchers named Bernt Bratsberg and Ole Rogerberg did something brilliant. They analysed data from 730,000 Norwegian men, basically every male born between 1962 and 1991 who went through military conscription. But instead of just comparing different birth years, they looked at brothers within the same families. Here's the key insight. If immigration or changing fertility patterns were the cause, you'd see differences between families. Immigrant families scoring differently than native families, or families with different characteristics. But that's not what they found. Instead, they discovered something much stranger. Younger brothers scored lower than their older brothers. Same parents, same genes, same family environment, but born just a few years apart. This pattern showed up across the entire country in family after family, regardless of the family's background. As Bratsberg and Rogerberg wrote in their paper published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, analyzing scores within families effectively disproves hypotheses requiring shifts in the composition of families having children, which includes both immigration and dysgenic fertility as explanations. Think about what this means. The cause of declining scores isn't about who is having children. It's something in the environment that's changing year by year, affecting everyone, even siblings in the same household. The mystery deepens. What could be causing it? So what is changing? Well, that's where things get speculative, because Bratsberg and Rogerberg could rule out certain hypotheses but couldn't pinpoint the actual cause. Maybe it's education. Not less education, but different education. A shift away from abstract reasoning and mathematics toward test preparation, rote learning, or different curricula. Finnish educator Pasi Sahlberg has documented how even high-performing education systems have changed in ways that might reduce emphasis on deep thinking. Maybe it's the media environment, the rise of television in the 1970s and 1980s, and then smartphones and social media in the 2000s. These technologies fragment attention, reduce sustained reading, and change how we process information. Reading a book exercises your brain differently than scrolling through TikTok. Maybe it's lifestyle factors. Sleep deprivation is epidemic. Teenagers today sleep dramatically less than their counterparts in the 1970s. Physical activity has declined. Stress levels have increased. Each of these factors affects cognitive function. Or maybe it's nutrition in a paradoxical way. Despite abundant calories, we might be getting less of certain nutrients. Ultra-processed foods dominate modern diets. Obesity rates have skyrocketed. Having enough food isn't the same as having the right food for optimal brain development. The fascinating and slightly unsettling part is that we're changing our environment so rapidly that we're conducting this massive, uncontrolled experiment on human cognition. And we won't know the full results until it's already happened. As Bratsberg and Rogerberg noted, their results remain consistent with a number of proposed hypotheses, including changes in educational exposure or quality, changing media exposure, worsening nutrition or health, and social spillovers from increased immigration, by which they mean indirect effects like changes in school curricula, not the composition of families themselves. Conclusion. The Flynn effect reveals something profound about how little we understand intelligence. For a century, something, maybe nutrition, maybe education, maybe modern complexity, maybe all three, made us better at IQ tests. Now that effect is stalling or reversing, and we still can't fully explain either the rise or the fall. Maybe that's the real lesson. IQ tests capture something real about human cognition, but it's something narrower and more culturally specific than we'd like to admit. We got better at a particular kind of thinking that modern life requires, and IQ tests measure. Whether that makes us genuinely smarter or just better test takers might be a question we'll never fully answer. But one thing is clear. Whatever's causing the reversal, it's not about who we are, it's about how we live. The same environmental factors that boosted our scores for a century can apparently reverse course and drag them down again. And that means potentially we could change it, if we can figure out what we're doing wrong. The mystery continues,